The Elder Scrolls is one of the most unique fantasy universes out there, and you may have, at one point or another, asked yourself how it all came to be. What inspired the Elder Scrolls in a lot of its crazy lore, and what aspects and pieces of real-world history, literature, mythology, and more can we see reflected within the games? In this video, we're going to be taking a look at some of the real-world inspirations for many of the things that we see in the Elder Scrolls series. Something that I'd say is pretty important to mention when it comes to this topic is the influence that the Elder Scrolls draws from the religions, cultures, and stories of many ancient civilizations, stretching as far back to the Mesopotamians. For example, the universe of the Elder Scrolls is known as the Orbis, and it was created by the intermingling of two primordial forces, known as Anu and Padme. The name Anu was likely taken directly from the Mesopotamian pantheon. To the Mesopotamians, Anu was the most powerful deity, the god of the sky and the heavens, and was essentially the ancestor of many of the religion's other deities. Also, the in Dagoth likely comes from the Mesopotamian city-state of which was one of the most powerful during its time. Similarly, the Mede dynasty that controlled the empire in the 4th era likely takes its name from the Medes, an ancient and mysterious Iranian civilization. Taking a broader look at deities, we can easily see that the name of the Daedric prince, Molag Bal, is derived from the name of two ancient deities, Moloch and Baal. In fact, in his Daggerfall concept art, he was just called a combination of the two, Moloch Bal. Moloch and Baal were both deities worshipped most prominently by the Canaanites. Moloch was commonly associated with terrible rituals that were carried out by devoted cultists. Baal, on the other hand, was a deity with its roots in Mesopotamia that was known as a fertility and weather god. But in the Bible, Baal is referred to as Baal-zebub, which was later known as Beelzebub, one of the most terrible and powerful demons. Molag Bal is one of the most chaotic and evil Elder Scrolls characters, so it's not that hard to understand where his name is derived from. A prominent deity in the Aldmeri and Bosmeri pantheons is Oghma, who is the wife of Xerxes, the god of ancestry and secrets. The name is also mentioned in the Daedric artifact, the Oghma Infinium. Ted Peterson, one of the creators of the Elder Scrolls, says that he once created a quest for a D&D campaign that he was running. His players had to find a tome created by the demon Orcus, called the Orcus Infinium. He wanted to reuse the concept for the Elder Scrolls Arena, but Orcus was a trademarked name, so they instead used Oghma, taken from a Celtic deity of the same name, who was the god of speech, eloquence, and wisdom. Oghma is also a deity that appears in the Forgotten Realms, the official and primary campaign setting for D&D. Tabletop role-playing games as a whole had a massive influence on the Elder Scrolls. During the early development of Daggerfall, in order to explore world-building possibilities, many of the game's designers participated in a D&D campaign. It revolved around them going around and gathering help from the various kingdoms in High Rock to fight against the Cameron Usurper. This campaign was later dropped in favor of a vampire, the Masquerade campaign, which is where the idea for becoming a vampire in Daggerfall was taken from. Many of Morrowind's writers were big fans of RuneQuest, another tabletop role-playing game, which Ken Rolston, who was Morrowind's lead designer, was actually once a writer for. Michael Kirkbride has stated that the lore of Glorantha, the primary setting of RuneQuest, as well as the Kumel, the setting of the Empire of the Petal Throne, are some of the biggest inspirations behind the lore of the Elder Scrolls. He also claims that the concept for the original pocket guide to the Empire was taken from the D&D Gazetteer series, which was basically a series of pamphlets that talked about the lore of several lands in the Mystara setting. Let's move on to mortals that became gods. Vivec's design is taken almost directly from the Hindu Ardhanarishvara, which is the half-male and half-female form of the deity Shiva combined with Parvati. Ardhanarishvara represents the combination of male and female energies within the universe, which also matches with Vivec's hermaphroditic nature. And then we have Tiber Septim. who managed to conquer all of Tamriel with the power of the brass golem Numidium, and later went on to ascend to godhood and become known as Talos. The name Talos is taken from the ancient Greek epic, the Argonautica, which tells the story of Jason and the Argonauts and their voyage to retrieve the Golden Fleece. Talos was the name of a brass golem that defended the island of Crete that was powered by divine ichor, much like how Numidium was powered by the Mantella. The name Tiber is taken from the Tiber River, which runs directly through the city of Rome. Roman mythology assigns a god to the Tiber River, being Tiberinus, who found the twins Romulus and Remus and gave them to a she-wolf that took care of them. Romulus then went on to be the founder of Rome, which ties back to how Tiber Septim went on to be the founder of the Septim dynasty. But, believe it or not, Talos isn't the only name inspired by Jason and the Argonauts. According to a 2014 interview with Vijay Lakshman, one of the series creators and the director of the Elder Scrolls Arena, he states that he was a big fan of older films. Having watched the 1963 film version of Jason and the Argonauts, the word Argonaut stuck with him and became Argonian. He knew he wanted them to be reptilian after seeing the stop-motion dragon in the 1958 film The Seventh Voyage of Sinbad. In the same interview, he states that he wanted to incorporate a feline race, being a lifelong practitioner of the martial arts and having an appreciation for movements of grace and agility. So, he derived the word Khajiit from the Japanese term for swordsmanship, Kenjutsu. He also goes on to state the origin of the concept for the Sorcerer class in Arena and Daggerfall. The Sorcerer class had an interesting gimmick in that you would start with 3 times as much magicka and be able to absorb magicka from spells cast at you, in exchange for not being able to regenerate magicka on your own. This was later retooled into the Atronach birth sign scene in Morrowind and Oblivion, and the Atronach standing stone scene in Skyrim. Vijay Lakshman states that this was inspired by the sword used by the fantasy character Elric of Melniboné, Stormbringer, that was able to absorb the life force of its opponents. While we're on the topic of literary influences in the Elder Scrolls, it might not surprise you to hear that Frank Herbert's Dune, as well as the 1984 film adaptation, was a very big source of inspiration. This can be pretty easily seen when you compare the narrative of Dune to Morrowind. In Dune, Paul Atreides becomes the prophesized Lisan al-Gaib, an outsider that appears before the Fremen of the desert planet of Arrakis and leads them to freedom and prosperity, and eventually overthrows the galactic empire that controls the planet. In Morrowind, you take on the role of the Nerevarine, the prophesized reincarnation of Indoril Nerevar, an outsider that appears before the Ashlander tribes and casts down the false gods of the Tribunal and saves Morrowind from the threat of Dagoth-Ur. From there, it's not hard to see the similarities between the Ashlander tribes and the Fremen, Moon Sugar and Spice Melange, and the Great Houses in both stories. And believe it or not, the concept of the Thu'um was inspired by the voice used by the Bene Gesserit, as well as the weirding module seen in the film. Moving on to other literary influences, you can find a few in-game books that take direct inspiration from real ones. One of them is Confessions of a Dunmer Skooma Eater, in which a Dunmer known as Til Sendis talks about her own personal addiction to skooma and her journey in overcoming it. This is a parody of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, a 19th century account of the author, Thomas de Quincey, and his personal experience of an opium addiction. In a similar vein, the book, The Art of War Magic, written by Zurin Arctis, is pretty directly inspired by Sun Tzu's The Art of War. But naming inspirations in the Elder Scrolls don't just apply to books. For example, Aldmeris, the mythical homeland and lost continent of the elves, derives its name and concept from a real-world fictional and mythic island, Atlantis. We can also see this in the East Empire Company, a powerful imperial merchant and trading organization that was commissioned by the emperor himself. This is derived from the historical East India Company, a massive English trade organization that once had massive economic and political influence over almost all of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. Many organizations across the Elder Scrolls in general were inspired by historical groups. The Blades, the elite unit that once protected the dragonborn emperors of the Empire, are pretty similar to the Japanese samurai. Like how the Blades served as spies and bodyguards for the Emperor, samurai would do the same for the feudal lords, or daimyo, that they served. The blades were also very influenced by the samurai aesthetically, carrying katanas and donning very samurai-like armor. And just look at Cloud Ruler Temple and Skyhaven Temple. Speaking of samurai, Frandar Hunding, the great sword saint in Onsei, was heavily inspired by the legendary Miyamoto Musashi. Frandar Hunding was a master swordsman that spent much of his early life traveling across Yokuda and refining his swordsmanship, becoming undefeated in over 90 duels. Upon defeating the evil Lord Janik and his 7 Lich followers, he believed that he had become invincible and retired to Mount Hatu. He spent 30 years in isolation there, compiling his philosophy and teachings into a book known as the Book of Circles, which became an integral part of Red Guard culture and swordsmanship. The samurai Miyamoto Musashi traveled across Japan in the 17th century as a ronin for several years, becoming undefeated in 62 duels and achieving the title of Kensei, the literal translation being Sword Saint. In the final years of his life, he retreated to the cave of Reiganado and authored the Gorin no Sho, the Book of 5 Rings. It details his Niten Ichi-ryu style of swordsmanship and his personal life philosophy. He also wrote the Dokudo, or the Path of Aloneness. Pelagius III, one of the emperors of Tamriel, is another character inspired by a historical figure, being King George III of England. Pelagius III was known as Pelagius the Mad for his eccentric and erratic behavior, much like how King George III was popularly known as Mad King George. King George was known to suffer from both physical and mental illness, resulting in strange behavior such as speaking incoherently without pausing for hours on end, as well as bouts of paranoia. And of course, some major events in Tamriel's history also drew inspiration from real-world events. One of them is the Thrassian Plague, a disease created by the Slodes of Thrace that completely ravaged Tamriel in the First Era, wiping out over half of the continent's population. This is inspired by the Black Death, a strain of bubonic plague that decimated Europe in the 14th century that managed to similarly kill about half of its population. And while it's not necessarily directly inspired by it, the Skyrim Civil War somewhat resembles the Germanic uprising and resistance against Rome. In the early 1st century, the Emperor Augustus wanted to expand the empire's territory beyond the Rhine River in order to bring Germania fully under his control. He tasked Germania's governor, Publius Quinctilius Varus, with consolidating Roman rule in the area through taxes and the enforcement of Roman laws. Germanic tribes resisted this, and were eventually led by the chieftain Arminius of the Cherusci tribe, who was serving underneath Quinctilius and secretly plotted a revolt in ambush. This culminated in the Battle of Teutoburg Forest, in which Arminius' forces decimated 3 Roman legions. This pushed the Romans back across the Rhine River, allowing Germania to stay mostly free of Roman influence. Again, the exact circumstances of both conflicts are very different, but barbarians rebelling against imperial legions under the leadership of a traitor is a common theme for both. And those are just some of the real-world inspirations for the lore and design of the Elder Scrolls series. If there are any inspirations that you know or have noticed, feel free to let me know in the comments below. And with that, I'll see you all next time.